A rare weather pattern not seen in nearly 5 years is about to grip the middle of the country, and over the next several days, millions of people are going to feel it. Tornadoes, flash floods, a brutal heat dome, and a tropics that just woke up, all happening at the same time. This is not your typical August setup. Meteorologists are calling this one of the most prolonged and dangerous stretches of severe weather this summer, and if you live anywhere between the plains and the East Coast, you are going to want to pay close attention to what is coming, because this pattern is not going away in a day or two. It is going to stick around, and it is going to keep firing storm after storm at some of the same communities over and over again. So let's talk about what is actually setting this up, because understanding the big picture makes it a lot easier to know what to expect in your area. Right now, a strong area of high pressure is building in over the southern plains. At the same time, the jet stream is roaring overhead across the northern tier of the country, running from the plains through the Midwest and into the Northeast. When you get a setup like this, with strong high pressure anchored in one spot and a fast river of air flowing around it, storm systems get funneled around that high pressure like cars going around a roundabout. Meteorologists call this a ring of fire pattern, and it basically means that day after day, disturbance after disturbance is going to ride along the northern edge of that high pressure, slam into rich Gulf moisture and unstable air, and explode into rounds of severe thunderstorms. This is exactly the kind of pattern that can produce back-to-back-to-back days of significant severe weather. And it is the reason forecasters are so concerned about what is coming over the next week to 10 days. Let's start with today, because the threat is already unfolding. There are two separate areas under a slight risk of severe weather. One stretches from central Illinois and the Chicago area back through Ohio and into Pennsylvania and Maryland. The other sits across parts of the northern plains. On top of those two zones, there is a massive area under a marginal risk that spans more than a dozen states, meaning that a huge number of people are in play today for at least some form of severe weather. The primary hazard is going to be damaging straight-line winds. We are not talking about a gust here and there. Forecasters are highlighting the potential for wind gusts as high as 70 to 75 miles per hour in some of the more intense storm cores this afternoon and evening. That kind of wind can snap trees, down power lines, and cause real structural damage, especially to older buildings, mobile homes, and anything with a large surface area like barns or metal roofing. Large hail is also on the table today, and the best chances for the more significant hail, the kind that can dent vehicles and shatter windows, will be across South Dakota and North Dakota. But it is the tornado threat that has forecasters watching closely today. There's a long corridor where at least a few tornadoes will be possible this afternoon and evening, with a couple of spots that could see a slightly elevated risk for a stronger tornado, mainly Ohio, western Pennsylvania, and eastern Illinois. The atmosphere in southeastern Ohio in particular is shaping up to be primed for rotating storms, with wind shear values typically associated with a higher-end tornado threat. If a currently weakening line of storms allows some breaks to develop, any storm that can go up on its own as a discrete cell in that environment could quickly become a serious tornado producer. There is also a second area to watch today, around Chicago, Milwaukee, and Lafayette. The atmosphere there has enough instability and wind shear that a few supercells could develop before sunset, and in that environment, an isolated strong tornado cannot be ruled out. The good news, if there is any, is that whatever forms is expected to quickly grow upscale into a line of thunderstorms, which tends to lower the overall tornado risk, though a line can still spin up a quick embedded tornado. Either way, if you are near Chicago or northern Indiana this evening, you need a way to get warnings quickly, because conditions could change fast. And then there is the flooding piece, which might end up being just as big a story as the tornado threat today. Storms across eastern Ohio are expected to keep repeatedly moving over the same areas throughout the evening, a process meteorologists call training, because storms line up and roll over a location again and again like train cars on a track. When that happens, rainfall totals add up fast. It does not take long for creeks, streams, and low-lying roads to overwhelm. By the overnight hours, this training effect is expected to produce a significant flash flooding threat across eastern Ohio, and it will not end when the sun comes up, with storms forecast to keep moving through into Tuesday morning. Now let's shift to tomorrow, because unfortunately the story does not improve. There's another slight risk area for severe weather stretching from around Chicago and Peoria back through Kentucky and into Virginia. There's also a very large marginal risk area covering a huge stretch of the country from Washington, D.C. back into the northern plains. In many ways, it is a similar setup to today, but the wind threat could actually be even more intense. Forecasters are highlighting the potential for damaging wind gusts of 80 to 85 miles per hour during the daytime hours from around Chicago back through West Virginia. That is significant hurricane force wind in some spots, and it is capable of producing widespread damage, especially to trees and power infrastructure that may already be weakened from today's storms. Large hail will mainly be a concern across the northern plains tomorrow. And while a few tornadoes will be possible, the primary threat looks to be more of a straight-line wind event, especially as storms organize into a line. That said, when you get a fast-moving line of severe thunderstorms like this, it is common for a quick spin-up tornado to develop embedded within the line, and those can happen with very little warning time. This is exactly why having multiple ways to receive severe weather alerts matters so much during a stretch like this. A tornado warning issued for a line segment might only give you a few minutes of lead time, and you do not want to be relying on hearing sirens outside if you are asleep or indoors with the television off. By Wednesday, the pattern is still cranking. There is a large risk area for severe weather, stretching all the way from Nebraska back through the middle of the country into the Charlotte area. Damaging winds will once again be the main concern, but forecasters are also watching for large hail and the possibility of a couple of tornadoes. What is remarkable about this stretch is not any single day in isolation. It is the fact that essentially the same corridor of the country, the Ohio Valley and the broader Midwest, is going to be dealing with organized severe weather threats 3 days in a row, sometimes hitting some of the exact same communities that were impacted the day before. That kind of repeated impact compounds the danger, because trees that survive one round of high winds may be more likely to fall in the next round, and ground that is already saturated from one round of heavy rain is far more prone to flash flooding when the next line of storms rolls through. Let's talk more about that flooding threat, because it deserves its own spotlight. A front is expected to essentially stall out across the Midwest, and when a front stalls, it becomes a magnet for repeated rounds of thunderstorms, sitting there as a focus for new storms to fire along it day after day. This sets up a multi-day flash flood threat that will persist through the middle of the week across the Midwest. Areas of Kentucky, West Virginia, southwestern Pennsylvania, and southern Ohio are especially at risk because of the terrain in those regions. Steep hills and valleys cause rainfall to run off quickly into creeks and small rivers, and those waterways can rise from a trickle to a raging torrent in a shockingly short amount of time. If you live near a creek, a low water crossing, or in a valley in any of these areas, this is the kind of setup where you want to have an evacuation plan ready and pay close attention to flash flood warnings, because water can rise faster than you might expect, especially overnight when it is harder to see rising water levels. While all of this severe weather and flooding is unfolding across the middle of the country, there's another major story developing to the south, and that is the heat. As that same area of high pressure that is driving the ring of fire pattern continues to strengthen and expand, it is going to send temperatures soaring across the southern plains and into the southeast. This is a dangerous kind of heat, the type that builds day after day with little relief overnight. And it can be especially hard on anyone without reliable air conditioning, outdoor workers, elderly residents, and pets. Combine that oppressive heat with high humidity, and heat index values in some spots could climb into genuinely dangerous territory. If you are in the path of this heat dome, this is the time to check on elderly neighbors and relatives, make sure pets have shade and plenty of water, and avoid strenuous outdoor activity during the peak afternoon hours. So what happens after Wednesday? Unfortunately, this pattern is not expected to break down quickly. Guidance suggests the storm train is going to keep rolling through Thursday and Friday across the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, and back into the Central Plains. There is a chance that things could quiet down slightly by later in the week, but forecasters are already flagging the potential for another significant round of severe weather by Friday night into Saturday, likely centered over Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin, with the potential for damaging winds, large hail, and tornadoes once again on the table. Saturday could then bring yet another round of severe weather back into the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, and the Central Plains, with damaging winds as the top concern, but tornadoes not out of the question. By Sunday and into the following Monday, the focus of any severe weather risk looks like it will shift toward the East Coast, though confidence that far out is naturally lower. What makes this whole stretch so notable is not just the individual days, it is the sheer duration. This kind of extended, multi-day severe weather pattern in the middle of August is genuinely unusual. Forecasters are saying this is the first time in roughly 4 to 5 years that this part of the country has dealt with a stretch of consistently elevated severe weather risk, this deep into summer. Typically by mid-August, the atmosphere has started to settle into a quieter, more typical late summer pattern. Instead, this year the jet stream is staying unusually active, and that high-pressure system anchored in the southern plains is going to keep the door open for disturbance after disturbance to ride around it, which means this active pattern could persist through roughly the 20th of the month before there is any real sign of a break. Now let's turn to the tropics, because after a relatively quiet stretch, the Atlantic has woken up, and there are multiple areas being watched for potential development. The most notable of these systems is located in the eastern Atlantic, and it currently has around a 60% chance of developing into a tropical depression or storm over the next several days. There's a second area of interest just east of the Lesser Antilles with a lower chance of development, But even if it does not organize into a named storm, it is still expected to bring a good deal of rain to those islands as it moves through later in the week. A third area is being watched north of Bermuda, also with a relatively low chance of formation. For most of these systems, forecasters do not expect much to come of them. They are likely to remain weak, disorganized low-pressure areas. But that first system in the eastern Atlantic is the one worth watching most closely, since there is a real possibility it becomes an organized tropical cyclone later this week. As it moves west, it is expected to run into a fair amount of wind shear, which should limit how quickly it can strengthen, especially nearing the Lesser Antilles over the weekend. Beyond that point, the forecast gets murkier. Some models suggest it could track relatively close to Bermuda early next week, while others have it pulled harmlessly out to sea. Right now, the probability of a direct impact to the continental United States looks low, but any tropical system needs watching closely until there is high confidence it is weakening or heading safely out to sea. This is peak hurricane season territory, and even systems battling unfavorable wind shear can sometimes find a way to organize faster than expected. It is also worth talking about why a pattern like this tends to catch people off guard more than a single big storm day does. When there is one dramatic, high-profile, severe weather day, the warnings get plenty of attention, and everyone is on alert. But when the threat stretches across 5, 6, even 7 days in a row, there is a real risk of what forecasters call warning fatigue. After the second or third day of watches and warnings, some people start to tune it out, assuming that because nothing happened to them on day 1 or day 2, nothing will happen on day 3 or 4 either. That is exactly the kind of thinking that can leave people unprepared when the most dangerous day of the stretch finally arrives. In a multi-day setup like this one, the risk does not decrease as the days go on. It often stays just as high, or increases, as the ground becomes saturated and communities grow more vulnerable to repeated impacts. Cities like Chicago, Indianapolis, Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh all sit in or near this active corridor over the coming days. And even in a large metro area with modern infrastructure, that does not make you immune to damaging winds, localized flooding, or fast-moving tornado warning. Urban flash flooding in particular can be just as dangerous as flooding along rural creeks, because storm drains can become overwhelmed quickly, turning underpasses and low-lying streets into deep water within minutes. If you have travel plans through the Midwest or Ohio Valley over the next several days, check the forecast closely before you head out, particularly during the afternoon and evening hours when storms are likely to be strongest. It is also worth thinking through what you would actually do if a tornado warning were issued for your location in the middle of the night. Have you identified the safest place in your home, ideally a small interior room on the lowest floor away from windows? Do you have a way to receive an alert that will wake you up if a warning is issued while you are asleep, since many of the deadliest tornadoes historically have struck overnight when people were not watching the sky or the forecast? These are simple questions, but during an active pattern like this one, taking 5 minutes to answer them for your household can make a real difference if the worst case unfolds near you. One more thing worth mentioning is how this pattern fits into the bigger picture of the season. A stretch like this, with a stalled front, a ring of fire setup, and an expanding heat dome, tends to leave a lasting mark even after the most active days pass. Ground saturated from repeated flooding rains can keep river levels elevated for a week or more after the storms move out, so flood risk does not necessarily end the moment the sky clears. Meanwhile, that heat dome to the south is likely to keep influencing temperatures and drought conditions across the plains well beyond this week, and it could flare back up once the storm track shifts elsewhere. In other words, even once this stretch winds down, its effects are likely to linger as elevated river levels, soggy ground, and a plains region trending drier and hotter deeper into August. So, with all of that laid out, what should you actually be doing with this information? First, if you live anywhere in the broad corridor from the Central Plains through the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, and into the Mid-Atlantic, treat the next several days as an active, severe weather stretch, not a single bad day. That means having multiple ways to receive warnings, whether that is a weather radio, a reliable weather app with push notifications, or trusted local coverage during the afternoon and evening hours when storms are likely to fire. Do not assume that because you got through one round safely, the next will behave the same way. Conditions can shift from day to day, and a corridor that saw mainly wind damage one day could see a more serious tornado threat the next. Second, take the flash flooding threat seriously, especially if you live in hilly or mountainous terrain in the Ohio Valley or Central Appalachians. Never drive through a flooded roadway, even if it looks shallow, because it takes surprisingly little moving water to sweep a vehicle off the road, and depth is almost impossible to judge in the dark or heavy rain. If you get a flash flood warning overnight, do not assume it will pass. Move to higher ground if you are in a flood-prone area and stay alert until the threat clears. Third, if you're in the path of the expanding heat dome across the southern plains and southeast, do not underestimate how dangerous prolonged heat can be, especially paired with high humidity. Heat is one of the most consistent weather-related killers every year, precisely because people underestimate it next to something dramatic like a tornado. Stay hydrated, limit time outdoors during peak heat, check on anyone more vulnerable. And finally, if you are near the coast or in islands that could be affected by that developing Atlantic system, this is a good time to check your hurricane preparedness, even if the forecast track currently looks like it stays out to sea. Storms can change course or intensify faster than expected. Model guidance can shift meaningfully in just a day or two, and it is always better to have a plan already in place before you actually need it, rather than scrambling at the last minute when a watch or warning is suddenly issued for your area. The bottom line here is that this is a pattern that is going to demand attention for the better part of the next week, and possibly longer. Multiple hazards are stacking up at the same time across a huge portion of the country. Tornadoes and damaging winds in the Midwest and Ohio Valley, dangerous flash flooding in the same general region, oppressive and possibly record-challenging heat across the southern plains and southeast, and a tropical system that bears watching in the Atlantic. It is rare to see all of these ingredients come together at once, and it is even rarer to see a pattern this active hold on for as long as this one is expected to. This is not a forecast to shrug off, because the ingredients are lined up for real, tangible impacts. From downed trees and power outages, to dangerous flash flooding and the ongoing risk of tornadoes, layered on top of oppressive heat and a tropical system that still needs watching. Stay weather aware over the next several days. Keep your phone charged and your alerts turned on, and keep checking back for updates as this pattern evolves. Because with a setup this active, the forecast details are going to keep changing right up until each round of storms actually arrives. Make sure the people around you, especially anyone not paying close attention to the weather, know what is coming too.